welcome. This is Infocus. I'm Bradley Valenaki. We're talking about gender-based violence in Papua New Guinea. Is it the work of the police force? Is it the work of the NGO? Or is it a responsibility that you and I all share in actually contributing towards a greater good for men and women of all race, not only here in Papua New Guinea, but the world? And I'm privileged to have with me in the studio Dr. Fiona Hukula, who is an advocate for gender-based violence here in Papua New Guinea, and also our good governor from Sepik, Allan, also representing government on this issue. Thank you for coming on to the program.
My pleasure.
All right. So, first of all, when we're talking about gender-based violence, what is gender-based violence? Let's go back to the basics, and we'll start off with you, Dr. Hukula.
Thank you, Bradley. So, in the national strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, there's quite a broad definition of gender-based violence. And I think many times when we talk about gender-based violence, we assume or we think that it's only domestic violence or married pipe and these kinds of things that happen in the family. But the definition in that strategy, which is a government document, is quite wide, and it refers to any form of violence that is based on gender, which includes rape, sexual harassment, intimate personal violence, emotional violence, psychological violence, things like not giving money to help with the upkeep of families. All of that is captured in that definition of gender-based violence.
All right. So, Doctor, from your over 20 years of experience in doing this work, what have you seen over the years with regards to gender-based violence? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? What is the situation in Papua New Guinea?
So in terms of data, we can't really tell because we don't have a good system in place to collect data. So that's in our government system, even though that we do have systems there, but we aren't able to access that kind of data readily. And we haven't had any wide prevalence study done in PNG, so to understand the rates of violence. But we do know from studies like the Demographic Health Survey and other small pockets of research that's been done that we have high rates of violence. But also, I think quite worrying is that we've got high acceptance of rates of violence. So that's from both men and women in rural and urban areas, even though the Demographic Health Survey research finds that acceptance of violence is higher in rural populations by both men and women. So that's the kind of data that's available that shows us that we have a problem in this country.
All right. So, Governor Baird, you represent the parliamentarians when it comes to the government's response to gender-based violence in Papua New Guinea, but also a listening ear to what is actually happening with regards to women and girls right throughout the country. From the recent forum that was held, what's the sort of a message that came out from there?
Well, I think you have to go back to the beginning. I think at the beginning, you'll find that Parliament has not really concerned itself with the issues of domestic violence and sorcery-related violence. Parliament has been preoccupied with building roads, building bridges, free education, and all these sorts of hard infrastructure type matters of development, if you like. So the issue of domestic violence has actually been it's there, but it hasn't really been the focus of Parliament, I suppose. And I guess that may be reflective of community expectations as well. The community, as Dr. Hukula said, there's an acceptance of violence being perpetrated against other genders. There's a general level of acceptance. So perhaps the pressure hasn't really been on the parliamentarians to take a look at it. But then you've got certain parliamentarians like myself, Governor Parkop, and several others who want to do more than just build roads and bridges and classrooms and all these things. We want to look at society and try to see if we can figure out a way to turn society away from some of the things that are becoming normal. I mean, domestic violence is now normal. Gender-based violence is normal. It's happening in schools. It's happening everywhere. And the younger generation is becoming even more accepting of it. So, the job of parliamentarians is to look to the future. And if I'm to sit here in my current job and say, look, what's Papua New Guinea going to be like in the next 10 or 15 years? Well, in the next 10 or 15 years, our young men are already thinking it's okay to perpetrate violence on women. It's okay to rape women. It's okay to do all kinds of things to women. And it's okay. And what's it going to look like 15 years down the track? That's a terrifying vision of the future if we're not going to change these things which are becoming normalized in society. I mean, you look at sorcery-related violence. 20 years ago, our Highlanders were not torturing and killing women because they suspected them of being sorcerers. Fast forward to today, it's a normal accepted event, unfortunately. Is that the kind of society we want to build in the next 15 years? I mean, it's one thing to focus on roads, bridges, and free education and all these sorts of things. But if you're not getting these soft things right within society, the attitude right in society, it doesn't matter what you build. At the end of the day, I think society is going to be a terrifying place, particularly for women and girls. And we're already seeing that. I think now we're seeing snippets of what the future is going to look like. And I think that's the job of leadership. Leaders must be able to look beyond what ordinary Papua New Guineans are seeing. That's the job of leadership. We can't just be concerned with building roads and bridges and toilets and classrooms and all these things. We need to see what society is going to look like. That's what leaders around the world do. So I think what you're seeing in this parliament is you're getting a lot more parliamentarians who are looking to the future and worrying and being concerned about the future. And therefore, we came forward. It wasn't really Parliament that wanted it. It was a group of members of Parliament who decided to say, look, we've got to stop this. We've got to stand up. We've got to speak for the women because the women don't have a voice in Parliament. So it's up to us to speak on their behalf. Women are getting killed by their partners. There's all sorts of things going on. And they're getting away with it, you see, which is even worse. And society is saying it's okay for them to, we're making women and girls even more worthless, and that's got to stop. And so we came together as a coalition. I have to say, I commend the leadership of Governor Parkop, who, when he saw some of us speaking, he decided to, obviously he's senior, and he brought us all together. And obviously as our voices grew louder, Prime Minister Marape heard, and we are now taking all these things to a whole new level, which we've never been before.
All right. Interesting discussions there, Governor Bed and Dr. Hukula. We'll go for a short break and come back with more on the other side. Welcome to Infocus, discussions on gender-based violence. And I still have with me in the studio our good governor from Sepik, Governor Allan Bed, and also Dr. Fiona Hukula, who is an advocate of gender-based violence here in Papua New Guinea. And we're telling stories about gender-based violence and from the recent experience of the forum that was held recently. Governor, there were many stories that came about, and people, especially victims of gender-based violence survivors who came forward and spoke to you and the other members of the who were present. What did they highlight in the system that actually needed improvement or failed them during their time of need?
I think the most important thing that came through, and which is consistent across almost all cases, is the lack of, first of all, prosecution. That real serious situation around prosecutions. And then even once you do get prosecutions, convictions, not very encouraging either. So that whole system of justice that's supposed to kind of curb the, and put a limit on the perpetrators, you see. Everybody, human beings, if we are left to our own devices, we'll be killing one another. And that's why we've constructed laws and things. But those laws need to be policed and they need to be enforced by someone. And those enforcement mechanisms, those protective mechanisms, all of them have failed. And so, if you see it from a victim's perspective, it's like they're getting victimized over and over again as they go through the process to try to seek, first of all, to protect themselves. They're looking for some protection from the state. They can't get it. And then if they do push with the prosecution to try to get the perpetrator to stand trial or, get convicted and be punished for the crime so that at least that person can learn not to do it again, that system just doesn't help them. So I think you could say that the system being unable to help the victims is actually helping the perpetrators. That's the way I see it. And, if I'm to summarize from all of the stories we've heard from all of the victims.
All right. So from the figures that came out from that particular forum, registered cases, over 15,000 cases annually, 300 prosecuted and only 100 get convicted. That's pretty much, scary in a country like Papua New Guinea where we see, gender-based violence happen even outside of our doorsteps.
Well, actually, the 15,000 is in NCD. We don't have any real numbers for the rest of the country. That's just NCD. So, and you hear many stories where someone is a victim of violence and they turn up at the police station and they say, look, we need some help. The first thing the police officer says to them is, oh, I have family problem, you want to straight in the house. So you then wonder, of the 15,000 that were actually registered, how many got turned away and didn't get registered? So we've got to look at the data and we've got to be conscious that there are lots of other numbers that didn't make it into the data set. So in Papua New Guinea, when you see the number says 15,000, well, the real number is probably 90,000. But the others got turned away at the police station because the police don't want to waste their time taking notes and they don't want to put it on the OB and they probably don't have ink, they don't have biros, they don't have... So you got all these other issues that come in and compound it.
Or no vehicle to follow up on that matter.
All of that.
So, Dr. Hukula, if you could, jump in. Successive governments have come up with laws to deal with gender-based violence in Papua New Guinea. Those laws or policies, have they worked for us in Papua New Guinea?
So I think I'll follow on from what Governor Bird was saying, in that we haven't seen enough prosecutions that have led to some form of punishment for perpetrators. And at the same time, there's all of these other huge issues around things like police will say, "Mi plano got money for fuel," and these are things that are beyond the officer that's in the station. And then the other issue, and I've talked with many police over the many years over this, about this, is that it's often because of the cycle of violence. The survivor goes because she wants some help, and then they will threaten the house, and she'll come back and say, "No, I don't want to pursue the case," and so it's that cycle. And then they might see her again, and all of these things add to the big problem of trying to address, it's like domestic violence especially, and then with sorcery accusation, because it's a community-sanctioned kind of violence. Even when police go, the research that I was involved with most recently, the police who try, with the little resources they have, are often, they're outnumbered and they're outgunned, so they can't go in. And most of the time when they do go in there, their focus is on rescuing these women and taking them out to safety first, because it's often very hard for them to make arrests if nobody's going to come forward as a witness.
Right. Doctor, you spent over 20 years of of your practice looking at the laws to do with the policing, justice, and also issues of women and girls, gender-based violence, just going over the same sort of stories over and over and over again, does it trouble you at times?
Yes, all the time. It troubles me because we seem to be going around in circles. We also need to consider all these other factors. We've got a very high youth population, so we've got a lot of young men walking around who are not doing anything. These are all kinds of things that can also contribute to the ways in which they behave. And I think also our own, whether it's cultural or religious, or the way we think about the value of women in our society, we really need to start to rethink and maybe start to reevaluate some of these ways of thinking, because it does, gender inequality does contribute to our high levels of violence against women and girls.
In your research work, do you find that technology contributes to this as well?
Well, certainly we know now that we can see that people go out to social media and speak about their victimization, or survivors come out. So social media is both good and bad. But we also know that having mobile phones, and when coming back to this discussion about the definition of gender-based violence, there's a term called coercive control. And these things like man by texting Mary all the time, or Mary texting man and email constantly, you stop wearing him. All of these kinds of things are forms of gender-based violence in that it's controlling behavior. And this has for women's freedom of movement, freedom of expression, their ability to work, all of this kind of thing affects that. And so technology, like I said, is good, but it also has its, it comes with new challenges for us.
All right. Dr. Hukula and Governor Bed, we'll go for a short break. We'll come back on the other side with more on Infocus. Welcome back to Infocus. Continuing on from our discussions, Dr. Hukula, before the break, you spoke about something interesting with regards to women, and we see that many times, men following up on the women with text messages or phone calls or even emails, like you said, hurry up, what are you doing? But that's one form of suppression, and it's not right.
Yeah, well, so what I meant was that, and data from the One Talk Counseling Helpline shows this, that there's a large number of women who ring up to the helpline and say that, you know, they're harassed via these mediums of communication. So it's not sort of just saying, okay, you stop where, when I'm time by your penis walk, but it's consistent harassment of, and in other places, not in this country that we know of, but in other places, you know, tracking the movement of women, all of this kind of thing comes under this term that's called coercive control.
Even at the workplace as well.
Yes, so it's not necessarily the physical violence where you can see it on the face, but it's the other forms of subtle control that is a form of violence that really causes a lot of mental stress to those who are victims or survivors of this kind of violence. And it's something that we haven't really discussed a lot, because in PNG we talk about violence and we'll just say, or they fight. It's more about the physical kind of violence.
All right. So, Governor Bed, you got all plenty of beginning man only watch him display program long yumi tete na only thing o se mami alright long all get a time bagarapin Mary blong all long side blong talk na tu time only paiti mall display me ron na yumi all beginning man tu we mas no can soy mas all get a time long beginning Mary I got way blong straight all heavy.
Well, I'm straight. Time you don't go back or something. Time lo mibla. Time all money got difference. Normally, I'm all money it's a fight. Also fight one them knife or stick or stone. Also fight lo hand. Fast forward, come now. All young man all like fight all by kissing bush knife or kisim grass knife or all by finding mombla kaino sem mombla weapon, huh? And then you translate that igolong all meri tu. Time all like fight on the meri. All by start lo using more weapons na using more screwdriver na all hapain na all this plug or something. But the thing is, lo young man all must think him so all must think lo head blow it. So was all no got meri pigini yet. Then all must ask him all yet. So was bian only got meri pigini ni. All by like him narpla man by walking mosem lo meri pigini blow lo no got. So was pigini meri blow go na maritim obla man. All by hamamas so was desla man and me walking mosem lo pigini meri blow. One kind of them all two o'clock walk him now. Huh? So to the young people, the young men especially, I want to say this. We are building a country. This la work blow building country, I know work blow 111 members of parliament. It's not our job. And work blow man. It's all of us together. So if you are building a society, you yeta. Now this inside lo this house you walk in, I'm house blow fight him all merry. House blow kill him, bakrap him all merry, or make him kind this kind. Well, that's the future you are building. And that's the future you are going to live in. And house you walk in, yeah? So young men have to start asking themselves, is that the kind of society we want to build? I mean, I'm seeing educated men, many with senior positions, beating up their wives, even killing their wives. So that's the country we are building now. So onar laman we ol yang pla we ol inostapia do this plakan position. All by sitting down and looking na toko moraito. I mean that's the same question that I put to the chief secretary. If mibla lo government one bla senior workman lo mibla empati mo kili meri blame. Now we are talking about this issue. Do we leave it alone or do we act? I would prefer that we act and we say, look, this lamb wrong. So mibla rosi lo work, you go all kotim you, karabusim you. So that society, especially young man, can look at that is wrong. Because if we don't do that, if you mean not to talk no, you mean not put him stop, then basically, if you don't stop it, you are agreeing with it. This la issue of domestic violence, you can't say I'm neutral. There's no neutrality in this. If you're neutral, you're supporting it. So you got to take a stand, and what's your stand going to be? And that's why I think it's important for young men to start taking a stand. Because otherwise, household working lo pigidi meri blow lo time or household working lo susa blow lo time.
Right. And it must also be scary from the recent example we've seen at the University of Papua New Guinea, of course, the female folk, of course, trying to stand up for their rights and again being suppressed at the highest level of education in Papua New Guinea. And to see that it's already penetrated through the education system to a higher level like that must be concerning for us, Doctor.
Yes, absolutely, because there's there's an understanding that at that level of education, tertiary, that students will be able to engage in a way that's not what we saw at the university, in terms of understanding where the protest was coming from. And also, I think it's of great concern to see that what happened to the media, in that the media was being chased away and saying that it's an internal matter. That's exactly how we've been dealing with domestic violence all these years, that it's an internal matter. And the connection there, which I think the university students who chased the media away and who protested, the connection to the national level, what's going on with our politicians leading, they fail to make that connection, that this is not a domestic internal issue, but it is an issue of national concern, gender-based violence. And the girls on campus, female students, have every right to feel safe, and it's their constitutional right to express that they are not safe and ask for things to change.
All right. Final word from you, Governor Baird.
Well, my final word is that I think in our society, certainly from my point of view, bad behavior is becoming more and more prevalent and more accepted. And to me, that's dangerous. Bad behavior needs to be called out, and it needs to be sanctioned, and it needs to be stopped. And this is my concern. I mean, I speak a lot to my own people in Sepik, and I said, you must start to down him, biget passing no good, you must start to stop him. Because passing no good work will win. And you translate that to the national level. and you can see bad people, bad behavior, they're getting ahead, they're winning, while good people, good behavior is slowly being pushed into the periphery, and suddenly we are all going to be a nation of badly behaving people. And for me, I don't want to stand for that. I think we need to start to push and start to call out the bad behavior. Pasinugod and pasinugod. Yung tram na kalarim na bilasim na tok. Sandi blo house or sandi blo. No, we call it out. We stand up for what is right, and we do the right thing. Because as the point I made earlier, we're building a house. It can either be a good house, so everyone can live in it and be happy, or it's going to be a really bad house where it's going to be a terrifying place for women and girls in the future, because that's the future I see. If we don't start to take a big stick and start to deal with the bad behavior, particularly violence, and the big stick has got to be government. It's got to be the government agencies. It's got to be police. It's got to be prosecutions. It's got to be the prisons. There's got to be reform agendas. And then not only that, it's got to be community. Community has to say no. Because when the community says no, then member blo parliament them to buy. And by thinking vote blong him, and by being him like blo community. Now suppose community, I'm like him road na, breeze na, classroom na, house sick na, toilet or one something. Then that's what the member is going to focus on. The parliamentarian is going to focus on delivering those things. But if the community wants to build a society where it's full of good people doing good things, and they start to put that pressure on the parliamentarians, then you'll find that the parliamentarians will respond. And I think the entire system will respond. It's a democratic country. And that's why people have the freedom and the right to speak. That's why we are allowed to talk like this. We've got to use the democratic freedoms to build the society that we want. And right now, we're building the wrong society.
Governor Ben, look, thank you very much for coming on to the program, Dr. Hukula. It's a very big topic. We can go all day about this, but we only have limited time now. Thank you very much for coming on to the program.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
This has been In Focus. If you have comments on tonight's program, you can get in touch with us on the email now showing on your screen, or you can engage with us social on our Facebook and Twitter pages, or you can watch this program a little later on YouTube. From all of us here, stay safe. Bye-bye.